Hi everyone, welcome to the second edition of our PAE Astro Talks. So, and I just want to tell something. Like people have been messaging me personally. So the aim of these talks is not really to complete the whole material that the speaker has for himself or herself. It's actually to spark the interest and the curiosity, so that you people would know what all is actually happening out there, like what all topics are out there. Because during your undergrad, you don't really have any good astro courses. You don't know, apart from the few basic courses, you don't do any proper astrophysics, and that is why we have these talks where people are exploring their own research interests, so that people who don't even have this facility to explore research interests will actually get to know what all research is happening, what are the different ways of doing it. So the takeaway from this talk should be like what are the different topics, and if you learn about a topic, what are the important questions of that particular topic, and then what are the key words to know more about the field. Like you may not understand the whole talk as of now, but then if you remember the key words or write down, you can always later search those keywords on Google, or talk to the speaker after the talk, and then know more about the field if you're interested and if you find that talk interesting. So that's the main goal of this. And starting next week, we are actually going to start something new. Like as I was saying, I do have a multitude of plans, but I personally didn't want to put everything onto your at the same time. Yeah. So there is this thing that I shared with you all on the group. It's called Benty Fields. So Benty Fields is like a, so you have this Apple News app or Times of India, or there is this in shots, etc., right, wherein you actually get this news of everything that's happening around you immediately, instantly. Similarly, Benty Fields is such a website where you can actually go and get up-to-date information on the recent papers that are published on archive, and it's very easy to navigate also. So if you go, this is your account page, okay, where it says all the details that you've filled. And if you go to the papers, you can actually, you can select what all topics you want. If I go to open settings here, if you see, there are different topics, right? So you can go to physics, and you can go to the subtopic astrophysics and select what all stuff that you are interested in. Similarly, you can select all the fields that you're interested in. Like basically I selected high energy physics, phenomenology, general relativity and quantum cosmology, astrophysics and galaxies, high astrophysical phenomena, etc. Because these are something that I'm interested in. Search, email notify when new papers are available. It means whenever there's a new paper that corresponds to any of these topics that you have selected, you will get a daily email with the list of papers that different physicists and astrophysicists around the world have uploaded related to these topics that you have selected. So this is so handy. You did not go on archive and then scroll through the entire archive and get the papers. The papers will be delivered to you, and it's also so user friendly. And the next thing I would like to do is journal club. So I'm part of two journal clubs. This is my Penn State journal club. So we'll not look into that. I mean, I'll show you the example, but this is something that I created. It's called Astro. So there are two ways of joining this. So one way is actually clicking on this on the left side, join journal club. And here you can select the option, or you can search for PAE Astro. See, it appeared. You just have to type on PAE Astro and click join. And if you just click join, I'll get a notification and I'll manually let you in. Unfortunately, there is no automatic way of doing it, or else I would have shared that link and I would have made it automatic. I did search online, but there is no automatic. I have to manually let you in. Sorry for that. I mean, it's not my problem. Yeah. So if you go to this, like, yeah. So here, what one can do actually is, like, if they go to papers, and today, okay, so since Saturday and Sunday is a holiday, they don't really update anything on Saturday and Sunday. That's why you don't see any what's it, uh, inputs for Saturday and Sunday. But if you go to Friday, one can actually go through the papers, like look at the titles, and here if you click, it will show you the abstract, and it will also show you the figures. But I'll not click on that because it takes a lot of data. But if you look at the abstract and if you find it interesting, you could just vote, and if you vote for it, you can choose to what journal club do you want it to be voted for. And currently the default one is Numerical Utility Journal Club, but you could select PAE Astro. And if you only have one journal club, it will not even ask for such options, and it will just directly add the paper to that club. So every day you could just spend 5 minutes going through all these papers, which are coming from the options that you have previously selected that I told. You can say you can vote for it if you like that paper, and all the voted papers will appear here like this. It will tell you who is the most active member here and who is the organizer. In the case of PAE Astro, uh, I'll be the organizer, and whoever posts the highest will their name will appear here. I can remove that if you all want. That's not a problem. But yeah, so if you once you vote, it will appear here, and as more and more people vote the same paper, the number of votes increase. So we could do this every week, and after every week, some list of papers will be collected right at one place, and we'll go through the order. Like we'll first go with the highest voted paper, and briefly discuss about it. Like whoever did that paper, it need not be the person who voted it have to talk about it. No, it can be nobody volunteered it. Like it can also be anonymous. It need not be that. The other people will know that you voted for this paper. No, it's completely anonymous. So you can note at your will. But please don't vote too many papers only if you find it interesting. Because if you put all the papers on the archive, if you vote for all the papers on the archive, then it would be really difficult to discuss about any paper. But yeah, once the papers appear here, we could go through each one and say if someone has read anything about that paper, you need not go through the entire paper. You can just read the abstract, introduction, and the final conclusion. That's it. And if you're interested, you can go to the rest of the sections too. But it's not mandatory. And it's also not mandatory that you have to go through all the papers that appear here on the journal club. It's up to your own interest. That's all. Nobody is pushing anything. So yeah, and so we'll go. So each and every paper, we can actually look at that paper. See, automatically opens the paper for me. It will take some time to load since I'm doing so many things at the same time. Yeah. So you could go through the abstract, the introduction, and skip everything. It's 15 pages long. It's a very important paper from my research. But yeah, you can skip everything, and you could just after reading abstract, you could go to conclusions and look at the discussion if there is such a section called discussion in the paper. See here, discussion. That's all, and you need not do anything else. If you're interested, you can go to the rest of the paper too. But yeah, and as we move from one paper to the other paper, I'll ask you as a moderator if someone has something to say about this. And the reason as to why we're doing this, why we're doing all this is because uh, yeah, before voting, that's what I'm trying to say. Before voting, you can just go to papers, and if you click the papers, a day will appear, and you just have to click on that day. And if you click that day, all the papers that I've uploaded to the archive will appear here. And how to, I'm repeating again, select only few particular fields by going here. Once you click papers, go to open settings, and here you can select what all subtopics you're interested in. So select only those you're interested in and save, close settings, and then starting from tomorrow, you'll get this list. Like you can go to daily papers. So today is, you just have to click on this and you'll get access. And these are on archive. So you need not go through any firewall or something. You just have to, what's a view PDF. If you just click view PDF or on this, it will just pop up in a tab, in the next tab, new tab. So yeah, yeah. This will be uploaded on the YouTube. So don't worry. Yeah. So the reason as to why we're doing this is because I know you people may think that reading papers is too advanced, will not understanding. I'm telling you that's not how research is done, because you can never know enough to actually start research. That's not how it works. You always start with something, with whatever knowledge you have, and you just build on it. And there are two different kinds of knowledge. One is working knowledge and one is called academic knowledge. The academic knowledge is essential for skills, like to be able to solve the things. But working knowledge is something that's required to actually what say put some new questions out there, or come up with your own questions, come up with your own solutions, or know what different people are doing in these areas. Like your approach might be different and someone else's approach might be different, so you want to know what are the other approaches to the same problem. So you want to know all this because you want to know which approach is better. So you know all this only through reading papers. Nothing of this is mentioned in your textbooks. So if you just stick with your textbooks, you will never ever climb up the ladder in research. So if you're really serious about making a career in astrophysics and doing research, start today. Start reading papers. Even if you don't understand, it's fine. It's fine, because we all start from being dumb. So it's okay to be dumb. Just don't stay dumb. So I'm telling you, do uh, and here everything is anonymous. So you need not feel that someone is pointing a finger at you, and nobody is forcing you to do anything. You all came here on your own interest, right? So this is something. And if you want, I can just discuss for the 1 2 papers, the first 2 papers that appear next week, and I can tell you also this is how it's done. So you should know, you should develop the skills, like how to read a paper, right? Like there at least 50 60 papers appear every day on the archive, and obviously you can't go through all the 50 60 papers, right, in detail. So you need to know how to read papers also, and how to organize the knowledge that you're gaining through this forefront. Like all this knowledge is not found in textbooks, guys. And people keep on asking me uh, how to get into the astrophysics. So this is how you get into astrophysics. It's just not this. Like I also shared another link. uh, it's called Astrobytes. Just give me a minute. Yeah, so the Astrobytes page, it's a very good page, because here you could actually go and see daily paper summaries. So whatever papers that appear on the archive, you can first go to the archive paper, and someone or the other from this Astrobytes organization might have written a article on it. So they just summarize everything that's there in the paper for people like us who are not so familiar with the field but wants to get familiar with the field. So you can go through that article, you can read through that article, and they also put good references. So you can go through the references too, like they're referring here a Wakefield experiment, and then some other studies that have done similar things. So you can go through all of this. So I would say if anyone really wants to start with astrophysics, the first 2 things that they should do is start reading these papers, get a broad overview of the field, start asking questions. The questions may seem very trivial, but still keep asking questions, because you have to start somewhere. Nobody actually is suddenly given a gift of asking awesome questions. Everyone has to start with some sort of questions or the other, and eventually you will develop that habit, skill, experience, and then you will ask more good questions. So yeah, do go through Astrobytes and this Benty Fields website, and I hope by the next week. So the next will be on 22nd, and on 22nd I hope a lot of votes will be there, so that we can go through some of the papers. So what you could do is by Friday everything will be closed, right? As I said, Saturday Sunday is a holiday. So by Friday everything is closed. So on Friday evening, whenever you're free, or Saturday morning, you can just go through the papers that other people voted, apart from the papers that you voted. So go through these papers every day, for at least for 10 20 minutes. Make it a habit, just like reading a newspaper. And on Saturday, just go through the papers that you find most interesting, and jot down some points that you want to pitch, so that other people will not will see what important stuff you understood from the paper. It can be any trivial thing. So this is a conversation, this is a group of like-minded people. So please don't feel embarrassed or anything. Yeah. And after that, I mean, today it may happen for 1.5 hour or 1 hour 45 minutes. Sorry for that, because I really want to discuss few things. Now we have looked at the Bentifields and the Astrobytes, and there are a lot of other magazines too that you can look up online, like Quantum Magazine, etc. I'll link them up on the Google Doc and I'll share it again. After the talk, I do link everything and I'll be sharing them. And you can always go through the entire material even after the talk, and whatever question you may have, you can always talk to the speaker. And again, please don't think that you have to understand everything. No, that's not how it works. That's what I keep on saying. The goal here is not to understand the whole talk. The goal is here not to complete the whole material that the speaker has brought with himself or herself, but it's actually to let you know what's happening in astrophysics in that particular field and what are the open questions in that field. Those are the main takeaways. And on top of that, if you can understand something else, it's good. If you don't, you can always go to the the material later, and talk to the speaker later. So that's one thing. And we also have a previous speaker, Sheeladitya Devnath. Unfortunately, due to some connectivity issues, he couldn't complete his talk. And I don't know if people have some questions. We'll do take up some questions regarding stellar evolution. Whatever question you may have, relevant to talk, or I mean that belong to the talk, or anything that's related to stellar evolution, towards the end of this present talk. I give the floor to Divyanshu Tiwari, who is a fourth year Triple student at LNCT Bhopal, and he'll be talking today about giant planets we find in our in other solar systems too. So he basically wants to tell you all that there's a lot of uncertainty in actually understanding how these planets itself form. I mean, leave black holes, neutron stars, etc. We don't even know how a sun formed or how our planets formed. So he wants to shed some light on that. That what's the uncertainty that we have, and what do we at all know about this formation of giant planets. And also he'll be briefly talking about the atmosphere of those giant planets. And he is open to questions during the talk, and treat this like a conversation, not like a talk, as I keep on saying. You can raise your hand, and I'll moderate. And so please raise hand only if you have a question or if you have a doubt. So yeah, and again at the end of the talk, we'll have a 10 minutes Q&A for this talk, and some other 10 minutes for the stellar evolution talk. So, and now I'll be sharing a form. So please do fill that form, and the key word of today is giant. So yeah, with that, I think Divyanshu, you can start. Thank you.
So hello everyone, I'm Divyanshu. So the topic of today is probing the giant planets. So there are a few things first that I want to discuss with you all. So this is going to be more of a discussion. I'm not an expert in these topics, so I'm just a beginner like you. So if you ask smart questions, I will not be able to answer it. But yeah, we can have a meaningful discussion over things, and we may find some new insights because of you or because of any discussion that we care to happen here. So this will be the first thing. So, this is a representative version of our solar system, and we can see that the planets are in the plane of the solar system, right? But the outer, as we go through the solar system, we see that the planets and their orbits are also inclined as well as eccentric. We can see that the Haumea, that was these very high inclined orbits with respect to the plane of our solar system, and this is the major representative version of our solar system. So what is this? This is the mainly the representative version of what the distances of our outer giants are. I mean, Earth is at 1 AU, Jupiter is at 5.2 AU, Saturn is 1. So we can read the data. But the interesting thing was how we find out the 5.2 AU. And it was an interesting story regarding the definition of standard lights and the transit of Venus and all that. So we're not going to there. But yeah, it was an interesting story how we got the exact distance of AU. So because we are mainly concerned with the giant planets in this talk, that's why I've only included this version of this representative distances. So yeah, this is another picture of our solar system. So what is this? It is the picture of in the planets in terms to their relative sizes. In a first look, we can classify them as these two planets, and these two planets belonging to one group, these four planets belonging to one group, and these small planets belonging to one group. And yes, these are the trans-Newtonian objects such as Pluto and everything, Eris and all that. These are the ice giants, as we call them. These are the gas giants, and these are the four planets. These little things are the asteroid belts and the objects such as Sirius. So this is these three pictures was provided here so that we can have a basic idea of how our solar system is. So major theories on the formation of our planets. So in order to understand the formation of our planets in our solar system, we have to understand the formation of our giant planets too, because the formation of those planets are very closely linked with the formation of our solar system. So initially, we have these like two theories that are, I mean, currently accepted as to what are the creation theories of our planets and the solar system. Core accretion theory and the disk instability theory. So core accretion means that the collision and coagulation of solid particles into larger bodies until a massive enough planetary embryo is formed, that is 10 to 20 Earth masses, to excrete a gases develop. We can read here the points, but in all, it revolves around the fact that we have like small dust particles that come together and coagulate in the protoplanetary disk, and after a few masses, they form a runaway growth. A runaway growth meaning that they capture all the gaseous material inside their disk, so they become planets. The basic problems that are associated with this model is this meter size barrier. This meter size barrier is a big problem for our computational models, because this model dictates that when the particles come together and join together, and after a size of few meters or a few kilometers, they are so in high velocity around the star that they break apart themselves together. The collisions that are happening are at very high speed in comparison to the coagulation of the material. So this is a very major problem associated with this model. Now, desert region problem. This problem arises from the fact, after the fact that when we look at our solar system, we think is that our is a pristine. It's all good and fine. The planets are in their good orbits. But when we observe the exoplanets, we found that there are many types of planets that are in the desert region. So what is a desert region? According to the core accretion model, there is this mass, this mass of the planets of this mass, and inside the region of this 1 AU should not be possible with this planetary model, core accretion model. But it happens so that we have the almost the major portion of planets found in this area. So we had like very, opposite results from which our theory was formed and what we have observed in the other solar system. So yeah, these two problems are the major things that are harboring this theory. Next, we move on to the disk instability theory. So what is a disk instability theory? It basically relates to the stability of disk. So as the disk around the protostar, when it's beginning to form, the disk spreads out in a very far, up to the distances of about 100 AU. So when this happens, this disk acquires its own gravitational, attraction. It's not only attracted to the planet, but it also has this own gravity. Can you elaborate the desert region? Yeah, I will. Sure, actually. Sure. So let's move on to this, and then I will elaborate it. So what happens in a disk, in a stability region, that when this disk requires the self gravity, the small fragments of it break away from this disk. Okay, so these small fragments, as we call small, are not really small. They are very big. They do form our giant planets, or as we call them, according to this theory. So this is it. So there's this mathematical Q factor, and we call it a Q factor, and it has some formulas for it. It also relates to the speed at which the particles rotate inside it and the speed of the planetary disk. And I don't know why this is named sigma. I found it confusing when the first time I read. So there was this astronomer Tunde. He found that this can quite be real, and we can get the planetary model from this model. So desert region is a region that is predicted by the theory of our core accretion that no planet should reside into that. I mean, the planets that are mass 1 to 20 times mass of our planet Earth residing in the orbit of 1 AU. But as we have seen the planets such as TRAPPIST system and other systems around the other stars, we have seen that most of the planets reside into this region only. So we were very wrong about that. So that is the desert region problem. And we explain them by various other models such as Grand-Tuck model and the NICE model. It's named after the city Nice because the group was working there. And Grand-Tuck model relates to the movement and the migration of Jupiter's towards the sun and then going after away. So there are few explanation to this desert region. Yeah. This actually, do any of these theories? Yeah, the Grand-Tuck theory that I described is actually because of that the material inside the asteroid belt could not form the planets. Yeah, that is the main reason that we understand by it, that the planets like Jupiter and Saturn they migrated into towards the proto sun or the sun that we call it, and then moved away, and this took away the major material from the asteroid belt and threw it away outside our solar system or towards inward. This also explains the mass of the Mars because it is 1/10 the, I mean, it's very less. From these theories, it should have more mass, but we have observed that it has very less mass. So this theory, the Grand-Tuck theory that explains the desert region problem, also explains the formation of our Mars. Probing the giant planets. So what we have seen here that the discovery of giant planets orbiting other stars is a opportunity to learn about more objects. Okay, so we have Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and we have such as Cassini-Huygens or the Juno spacecraft that is currently, and the Galilee space probe that was launched into the atmosphere of the um, Jupiter. So there are like various probes that get sent to them, to the Uranus and to the Neptune. So we got a very large amount of data from them. We also can, from that data, we inferred the dense cores that these planets have, and we also have very questions that are yet to be answered. I mean, in the community too, and also me, I don't know anything in regarding to that. But yeah, in the community too, the major questions regarding the formation of these planets are yet unanswered. So this is the basic view of calculation of interior models of our giant planets. So this is a very simplified version. We actually have very complicated interaction between various forces inside the major planets. So these assumptions are taken very easily. I mean, they are overly simplified in order to model them on a computer system. So we are taking assumptions such as that giant planets are made of fluid envelope. Fluid here means that not only the fluid, I mean water and all that, but also the gaseous material, and possibly a dense central core of about 15 Earth masses. The envelope is mostly made up of hydrogen and helium and trace species of heavy elements, such as actually anything in the norms of astrophysics call everything higher than the hydrogen and helium heavy elements. I don't know why. The core is made up of an combination of rocks as well as the more volatile species such as H2O, water, CH, methane, or ammonia in the fluid state. Why fluid state? We will get to that later. So in most cases, rotation and magnetic fields are neglected. So this is a very major thing. We can't neglect that. They highly affect the formation of planets and everything. But for the sake of simplification, we are neglecting it. I will not go into the detail here, but the basic equations are what we can infer from these models. That there should be a hydrostatic force due to the fluids present in it, thermodynamic force to relate the flow of heat from the core to the outside of the planet so that atmospheres can behave with respect to them, the law of mass conservation of how the matter interacts with all of that, and the energy conservation equation, that is the energy del L by del, that is the luminosity that is represented by that planet, or the energy that is dissipated into its space surrounding it. So we'll move on to that. Outer layer of our planets are very cold. I mean, 50 to 3000 K, and are at very low pressures. I mean, 0.1 bar to 10 bar. That is, you can 10 times to the atmosphere of planets Earth. What we have here is that this region says that we have hydrogen in a metallic state. Hydrogen in a metallic state means it is in a liquid metallic form. And what we have here is that these are the projected cores of the Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. So we can see that from our models that Jupiter is predicted to have a wrapping of hydrogen metallic. In a similar way, we can sense that Saturn is also predicted to have a hydrogen in a metallic form. But these dashed lines indicate that we are not very sure about the cores of Uranus and Neptune, of these fluids around the cores, because experiments are needed to infer that the change of the phase of hydrogen from an atomic form to its metallic form, and these kind of experiments are very hard to do. But yeah, the progress is being made on, and we don't know. For Uranus and Neptune, the situation is actually very complex, because at large pressures they are not expected to contain hydrogen. But the models that we have here, that we try to solve the problems here, they show that they should contain the hydrogen fluid. So we are not very sure about the interiors of the Uranus and Neptune, and at least the interiors around the core. I mean, calculated over the entire domain of pressure and temperature spanned by the planets during their evolution. And this evolution is a very hard term. I mean, this is very, difficult thing to do. I mean, pressure changes from the initial to the final version of the planets that we have here, and the temperature from initial to final are very tough to do. And also the equation of state that we have used to predict those models did not had the heavy elements and all. I mean, they only contain hydrogen and helium for the very approximate way. But yeah, we don't know so many things. I mean, inclusion of these heavy elements now, they affect the formation of these, we don't know yet, because they can happen to do. We all know that the three ways of heat transfer, radiation, conduction, and convection. And the major way in which the heat transport inside a planet or inside the region around the cores and the mantle happens is from the convection. Okay, so at the temperature range of around 1200 to 1500 K in these planets, we have an opacity due to hydrogen and helium absorption. I mean, what happens is that the heat gets re-radiated towards the core itself. Also, two major things affect here. The rising number of electrons greatly enhance the absorption of hydrogen atom and helium atom. And the TiO, a very strong absorber at visible length, is freed by the vaporization of TiO3 due to very high temperature. So, I mean, this opacity rises rapidly, which ensures that the transport of heat is, very efficient. But yeah, another thing that happens is the conduction by free electrons. So, but we don't know the densities, if there are enough densities so that the free electrons can transport heat easily or not. But yeah, we are very sure about the near region of center core, but upwards from there, we don't know. What is this? I mean, mass and radius relation. What do we understand by this? That an body acquires mass, so its radius should naturally increase, and that's what the region up to this here is described by. Actually, up to the outer planets, but up to Jupiter. So this is the. Can you see the biggest dot in the between the black dot? This is marked by Jupiter. So this is what we have here. Our the Jupiter. This is the graph of the Jupiter, and we have some models that predict the mass of the Jupiter, and we have the graph of we find that the mass of Jupiter and its radius. Okay, so it also describes the planet. It also describes the graph of Saturn and the Uranus and Neptune in the leftmost corner. The other red dots are actually the exoplanets that were found in the various regions of these. These are actually the anomalies to our prediction models, but yeah, we found them, and thus and orders suggest that we should have theories in explaining them. In order to compare these, we have this water ice and these olivine models. I mean, we are assuming that the whole planet is made up of water, ice, or olivine. Olivine is a very hard material. Yeah, okay. So this time the extra solar planets, solar planets, this SOVA that was back in 2004 when this paper was published, all lie above the pure hydrogen helium curve. This is due to the fact that these planets have their evolution dominated by the intense solar stellar radiation they receive. Why? I mean, because the major of the planets that were discovered around back in the 2004 were actually were actually measured by, um, were actually found very close to their stars, and they were actually measured by transiting systems or radio velocimetry method. So these were the planets that were found above this curve because of the intense stellar radiation they receive. So at these regions, when the exoplanets are very close around their stars, thermal effects are no longer negligible, and this affects the more complex of the growth of the planets around their stars. So, yeah. So rotation and figures of planet. So all the giant planets such as our Jupiter, Neptune, and Saturn, Uranus, these all revolve around very fast. I mean, very fast in the matter of hours. And the hydrostatic equation that was very in a simpler form is modified due to that fact. The major thing that we take away from this is this. This is the formula of the external gravitational potential of the field. I mean, the rotation, that is the gravitational. So there was this equation, and we had J2n in it. So what does it matter? So the layers of the planet the layers of the planet, I mean the planet, and it has composition of various layers. These various layers together have different kinds of movements or the different kind of effects around the gravitational field around its region. So what we do here is that we send the probes and the space probes towards these planets, and we move around them in a polar orbit, that is through the polars. Okay, so currently Juno aircraft is doing that, and Galileo aircraft did that. So what we get there is that we get these subtle changes in the gravitational fields, and we associate these changes with the interiors of the planet. We cannot, I mean, infer everything from this, but this does actually set the constraint or the limits of those composition around the planet. So that is the major takeaway here, that when we send the space probes to this is one of the major things to do to measure its gravitational field perturbations around it, so that we can get the J2, J4, J6, and J8 values, so that we can put constraint on the models of the atmospheric models of the planet. As I said, the giant planets are relatively fast rotators with periods of about 10 hours for Jupiter and Saturn and 17 hours for Uranus and Neptune. Now, these fast rotation actually makes them very, I mean, they are very stretched out at their equilateral radii. So we can infer that from the data that I've seen here. And one of the major things that I think we can understand is that our four giant planets all have an axial moment of inertia substantially lower than the value for a sphere of uniform density. So indicating that they have dense central regions. Yeah, I mean, we know that from this thing we know that they should have a dense central regions. I mean, it does not essentially mean the core, but we can have a few, I mean, takeaways from this. I mean, what do we mean by they do not possess a core? I mean, we are not talking about a core that is specified at particular levels. We can also talk about a core that is in a smushy type of situation, kind of like when we take a coffee or when we take a tea and we mix some sugar in it, but we don't stir. So what we get is a mushy mass at the end of the tea or at the end of the last sip. So that is what we have here. I mean, what do we understand that by that they think that we know about they possess a core or not. Atmospheric discussion that it actually mainly contains the thing that the hydrogen and the helium that are present in these huge quantities are actually very hard to detect in the precise nature. I mean, they have the zero dipole moments. Their rotation lines are very weak and broad, and the lines due to electronic transition correspond to very high altitudes in atmosphere and bear little information on the structure of the deeper planets. What do we mean by that? Is that by seeing the lines of these S2 and helium from the probes or from the dishes that we send or from the spectroscopic analysis, we can't really infer much about the course of these planets. We can only get the understanding of the topmost layer, that is the atmosphere of these planets. The only robust result concerning the abundance of helium in a giant planet is by in situ measurement by the Galilei probe in the atmosphere of Jupiter. So Galilei probe was, it got into the Jupiter. It survived for about 25 or 30 bars, I guess. So the probe was fallen into the dry region of atmosphere. This was actually very embarrassing, or what we say, we got unlucky there, because when we were falling into that, we indicated very low amounts of water in it, but our models predicted high amount of in comparison to that, we had substantial expectation from the probe that we will detect high amount of water, but thus it got into the dry region of Jupiter's atmosphere. And how do these dry regions form? Well, the clouds spinning, and what happens that the water gains, and they form a cloud, and then they fall lower in that region. So what do we have there? We have the less number of water molecules at that region. In the case of Saturn, both carbon in the form of methane and nitrogen as ammonia appear to be slightly enriched, but with very large errors. And in Uranus and Neptune, methane is probably 30 to 60 times the solar value. What do we mean by solar value? We mean that the amount of the methane that is present in the sun, and we should not have this, but these are due to the fact that the asteroids came to it and then collided. The methane rich, actually, or meteoroids. So interior models of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. This can best be explained by the figure that we have here at the end. So this is a very nice picture that summarizes the atmospheric composition of these planets. For Jupiter, we have here the molecular hydrogen. And these are the major proportion of that. It's not an exhaustive list, but these are what we have predicted and what we have observed from these data sets that were back in 2004. And from that, we have inferred that at least this should be in the planets, and this should be in the giant planets. So what we have here is that molecular hydrogen, 23% helium, and this metallic H. So this is a major thing, because what happens here, and this, we have around the region of the core and the metallic edge, we have helium drops falling from that core, from that mantle region to the core region. Why this happens? Well, it's another story. But yeah, we have models suggesting that the helium drops from this metallic edge region forms and then drops towards the core. This is due to the fact that we have very less in helium in the upper layer of our Jupiter. So we also don't know more thing. We don't know whether it happens in Saturn or not, but we are sure that it should happen. And we can see that the major portion of this is hydrogen, more than the Jupiter. And for Uranus and Neptune, we are not very, it is very ambiguous. We don't even know ice rock, and you can see the question mark. The author was very confused about that, because it's not that he was only confused. It's because the data sets that we have, the models that we have, we could not predict. There's so much of slight modification into the equation of states or in the initial conditions would lead to a so different model. So it's very hard to predict these interior models unless and until we drop them a probe, so that we can understand the upper atmospheric regions, and then we can infer from that the other things. Yeah, this is a section questions, so that we can take away the basics things that we talked about it, and there are 2, 3, or 4, 5 questions, I guess, and we can just think about it, and we can have meaningful discussions upon them. So the first question is, what are the ages of our giant planet? So if we understand something of the formation of our solar system, we guess that from the actually educated guess, we think that it's about 4.5 million years ago. So, but the model ages show a significant deviation from that. So, we don't know, because there are things that are very uncertain, because the most realistic EOS predict ages above 4.5. These things should not have formed till now, but yet these are there and we can see them, and they are very stable in their orbits, but it should not have happened because of the most realistic models. We are not sure what is going on there. and for Saturn we predict the ages of order of 2 billion years. So that so we are saying that the present state of Saturn should have been achieved 2 billion years ago. I mean 3 billion years ago actually. It should have been formed after the 2 billion years from the start of the Sun fusion process. So this is actually attributed to the presence of phase separation of helium and would lengthen the cooling and the time amount of the Saturn formation of the Saturn. The case of the Uranus and Neptune is less clear cut because of the uncertainties in the both the properties of their matter. Actually, we know very less about their atmospheres too. We haven't dropped any probe into them. We also have very less amount of data so that we can have very realistic models. And even after that, we have so many assumptions and so many variables that we don't yet know. And I mean, by me, it's not only about me and the scientists working upon this issue. It's very ambiguous area to work upon. So do some elements separate from hydrogen at high pressures? So helium is strongly suspected. We don't have the practical evidence for it yet. We are trying to ascertain from the experiments that are being done at the high pressure labs in USA and in any other region. I don't know more about this, but yeah, I remember some experiments were being done in USA about these, that the phase separation of helium and what happens when we simulate these hydrogen and helium in high m-bar pressures and high temperatures, and what happens, how they form phase separation and how they separate. We don't know exactly, but we suggest and we suspect that from our models it should happen. So how do the planetary interiors rotate? We don't know. The answer to the most of these questions is we don't know. We have these atmospheric zonal patterns that are, we observe from our planet-based observatories and the Juno spacecraft and the things that we send there. But and this should be tied to the planetary interiors, but we are not even sure that. I mean, whether they can just be the surface phenomena. I mean, the core can be calm and the topmost atmospheric surface can be violent, or it may be that like Neptune or like actually Uranus, it may be calm inside, but maybe violent inside due to the fact that cores are very ambiguous. So, but we know that in order to find that if the planetary interior rotate, we have to send the probes, and these probes can measure these gravitational movements. Remember what I talked about J2 movements in the gravitational field equation. So these J2 movements can be ascertained by flying many times poles around these planets, and Juno spacecraft is currently doing that, so that we will get more and precise information about these.
So a question from me. So the spacecrafts also measure the magnetic field, because magnetic fields can actually be short that the core is rotating, right? If you base our model on a dynamo dynamo model to explain the origin of magnetic fields in the planets.
Yes. They do. They actually do that. Because in this model we have neglected the magnetic fields. That's why I haven't talked about them. But your question is right. We certainly do have instruments that measure these things too, so that we have double checking kind of thing. That the effect. Yes.
Yeah, you're saying self-consistency, right? The whatever that you get from the gravitational perturbation, like variation in the field, variations in the gravitational field should actually somehow correlate to the magnetic field distribution that you have.
Yeah. I mean, it should correlate with them. Yeah. So suggesting that the differences in the magnetic field as well as the gravitational field come from inside the core and not from some surface phenomena such as lightning or any other thing. Yeah.
So, and a follow-up question, but I don't remember distinctly, but one cannot send these probes very near to the atmosphere or very near to the planet, right? Because the magnetic field becomes so strong. Like, for example, Juno really can't be sent very near to the Jupiter, because the magnetic field becomes so strong that it might actually damage the instruments or the detectors that it have inside. So,
yeah, it's true.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
due to the radiation belts around the core. I mean, Jupiter's magnetic field is massive. I mean, very massive. I mean, it traps these all so large amount of charges, and these all converge around the polar regions of the planet, and we can also see the beautiful pictures from the core from the Juno spacecraft. I mean, describing these areas, and they have these auroras. So yeah, it's a very high radiation region too. That's why we have these flybys. I mean, we can't. We have. I mean, these flybys are very quick.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the only way we can actually probe these planets is then to stay a bit far away, where the core effects might actually not be important.
No. So I mean, what do we do here? We get to the near of that planet, and then we go far. Okay. So
Okay.
yeah, so that we can a certain the time that we spend in the near of the planet's polar region, we get the data. So yeah, we go around that. We will. I mean, we go around that in slightly elliptic orbit or whatever. I mean, the thing that should save it from high kind of radiation that is going inside the poles.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I remember a thing about planet Mercury when we sent there the messenger probe. The messenger probe was in an highly elliptic orbit to save it from the radiation from the sun, and that's why it is spent. I mean, its orbit around the Mercury was very, I mean, amazing. I cannot remember how it was, but it was highly elliptic so that the measurements could measure the polar regions around the planet and then go away and then cool down, and thus it had a heat shield too, but yeah, it was a very amazing thing to do.
Yeah, maybe you could shed some light so that other people can understand as to why an elliptic orbit is actually preferred over a circularized orbit. Yeah.
Yeah, to majorly it's because to save the, I mean, instruments of that. Yeah, so that we can get the measurements and the instruments should perform as they should for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean,
would-
in a circularized orbit, it would rotate at the same radius for a long time, right? So it would get more radiation or more effects from the planet, but come in an elliptic orbit, it's only at a few instances that it actually comes close, and at the remaining instances, it goes far away. So the effects from the planet are actually small, and the instrument will not be under continuous load of this.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I mean, in a idealistic situation, a circular orbit is fine. I mean, it's best thing. We can go around for a few times and we will get all the measurements. But alas, that does not happen. We have various things to look for.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
why, yeah, that's why these selective orbits are preferred. So there's a question. Do you think that planets without host stars hover around space randomly? Yeah, actually, these are called, I don't know, rogue planets or what. But yeah, we have. I mean, we can understand from some models that sometimes the small planets or either the huge ones get thrown around. I mean, thrown outside the plane of the solar system, and they wander unless until another star captures them or not. And actually, I read an article that said that these planets could, I mean, these planets could survive by the internal heating and all that. I don't know, I don't remember, but yeah, I've certainly read that about planets without hope. Yes.
So just to add what Divyanju said, I did read some articles where they've actually saw some planets which shouldn't have formed in those solar system, like in that particular solar system, because according to the models that we have currently, it won't be able to explain how this planet forms. So that's why they say maybe this planet has migrated from some other solar system to this solar system and has settled in this solar system, and that is why we find this strange planet in a solar system where this can't be formed at all. So it formed somewhere and went somewhere else.
Yeah, we compare the stars spectroscopy analysis to the planets spectroscopy
Yeah.
analysis. Yeah.
And this can be seen in the movie on Netflix if you all watch. It's called Wandering Earth. So they actually try to do this, take our Earth to some other galaxy.
Okay. A kind of like an interstellar flyby through event horizon. Yeah. Um, Mama, yeah. I remember it. It's the first interstellar. Um, what I remember, interstellar. The neighbor or the guest from the outer of our solar system. It was predicted to have, and it was. I mean, we captured it from the space, and we got. Yeah, I remember it, but I do not exactly remember what it said. I'm really sorry about that.
Yeah, maybe whoever asked that question can get a link and then post it on the group so that we can have a discussion on that later too. Yeah. So I think you can continue, Divyanshu.
Okay. So, what can we tell of the giant planets cores? Are they primordial? Um, well, as you have seen, we don't know the most of the things that we from the models. We know that they can be well-defined, separate entities, and it's not the case. The thing is that they can be like mushy regions too. We may not have the clear, distinct boundaries between the regions. So yeah, it happens. So what is written here? Second, the convention does not. Finally, the history of core formation and the particular observers. Okay, yeah, so these are the various actually regions, so that we understand that this is not actually the case. The first thing is the solutions with a well-defined central core are equivalent to the solution with cores that have been diluted with the central half of the planet. What this says is that the models with the mushy core, cores that are well above into the upper layers, and the solutions with the well-defined core are actually equal. We get the same result from both kind of equations that describe these other two. These two models. So we can't ascertain very finite in a finite way that we know that these planets have cores that are well-defined or not. Second, the convention does not necessarily guarantee the presence of globally homogeneous regions and can efficiently oppose the settling of species as observed in Thermohaline Convention. Okay, what this line means is that while we know that convention actually, revolves the material up and inside from the inside of the core to the upper layers, but yeah, it's not necessary. It can also hamper the formation and the mixation of the, differentiation of the different kinds of elements around the planet.
So Divyansh, if I understand currently, you're trying to say that we don't, the results that we get out of taking a model where core has formed completely and distinctly, and the other case where the core actually extends up to the
Yeah,
surface,
more.
the surface. So you're saying we can't really distinguish between these because they almost give you the same results, right? So when you say results, what results do you mean? And the second question would be, uh, is there any observation which can actually break this degeneracy? So yeah.
Okay. So the thing is that the results is actually the composition of these planets. The models that we use to form both kind of things, the central core, well-defined central core, and the mushy core, that we don't know. Even if when we run these two models, after that, when we get results, we get the same kind of composition of this planet. Okay, so can you understand that? We get the same planet from both different kind of models. They both lead to the same thing, the final result of the Jupiter. So we don't know, we cannot backtrace it to a particular thing of if this model exists or this model exists.
So the only way to break this degeneracy is to look at the infant planets, like planets which are forming, so that we can look at the early phase of this planet formation, so that we can say this model is preferred over the other model, right?
Yeah, we can observe that. We can also have the better, I mean, models, or we can actually take better measurements. But I don't think better measurements is the case here. I don't really know actually for now. But yeah, good. I will search about that. What we can do to, at least remove this uncertainty. Okay. So there is a question in a webinar. I heard that a type of star resembles the type of planets. For example, red dwarfs resemble ice giants. Other exoplanetary discoveries show robust data about this. And could this be the reason why planets are? I don't understand. I can't relate why this should be the reason why planets are thrown away. No, if you're talking that a certain kind of planet should exist into that solar system and the other kind should, get removed from it, that is not the case here. But yeah, and the planets resemble the type of star because of the same nebula in which they are formed, right? And because of the same planets, these exoplanets that are thrown away are actually due to the gravitational resonances that the planets between revolving that are around that star have the gravitational resonance. What do we mean by that? Is that when a planet, suppose when a interior planet or gas giant around that star goes around 3 times, another planet goes around 2 times. So what do we have here is that we have here a gravitational resonance. While this will clear out the region between these planets, if we have another planet forming at the time of formation of these three, then these third planet will get thrown away from this. Okay, and any other cases, that star, that whole solar system can be perturbed by the neighbor, or if it's a twin star system, we can have the planets thrown away due to the interaction of these twin stars. So we don't know, and actually I don't know more of this.
Yeah, that's a good idea that you brought up. People can Google what gravitational resonance is, and Divyanshu did do a good job explaining it. But yeah, even that can be a good discussion later.
Yeah. So this is the final question. Do we understand planets' global composition? Simple answer: no. We understand the basic composition of these planets from the observation that we have made, but because of all the summation that I have told you and the things that we don't know about this, we don't know the global composition. And this global composition is the fact that the thing that I showed you, the images that I showed you, is not a final picture. We will have more refined pictures coming in. And actually, this was taken from an article back in 2004. So there are various things that are happening in this area, and I'm sure further or sometime in near future I will get back to you all with a particular more refined result from that. We have here a particular summation of these things, that the Jupiter's atmosphere is enriched in noble gases, and this is actually a puzzle. We don't know why argon is more inside the Jupiter's atmosphere. It should be less, but it's more, and we don't know. But now we understand, we can explain that by the clathration of noble gases and ice. And what does we mean by that is that these noble gases get mixed inside the ices of the meteorites, and when these planetesimals or the meteorites form at the very after the ice line. What does an ice line mean? The area after which the water can exist in the ice form at the solar system. So when the planet was forming, it could have been bombarded by the planetesimals that were including these noble gases in the ices form trapped in the ices, and that's why we could have a model suggesting that Jupiter's atmosphere is more enriched in argon. Okay, what do we take away from this talk? The major conclusion that was based upon this model. The giant planets of our solar system all contain a minimum of 10 mass of Earth. 10 times the mass of Earth of heavy elements, and even 20 times the mass of Earth for Saturn and probably Jupiter. In Jupiter, most of the heavy elements are mixed in hydrogen-helium envelope. That is the upper layer. And on the contrary, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune appear to be significantly differentiated. Differentiated means we have a different layers regarding different types of materials. The envelopes of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune are enriched in heavy elements compared to the solar composition, that is, our sun, implying that heavy elements were delivered after the formation, that is, from the bombarding of the planetesimals and the meteoroids, requiring large masses in planetesimals because of the low accretion probabilities, or when the planets, and in particular Jupiter, were not fully formed. In that case, an upward mixing erosion of these planets with the envelope is required. A third possibility is that these planets were captured in an enriched nebula. So what we have here is that we are trying to explain why these are enriched in heavy elements. So we have these 2 or 3 possibilities that they could have been captured in an enriched nebula, or they were formed after it, or they were included while forming. So we don't know. These are actually 3 possibilities are actually totally different, and we don't know it. And the demixing of helium in metallic hydrogen has probably begun in Jupiter and has been present in Saturn for 2 to 3 billion years old. So this is the main takeaway, that helium is actually raining inside the metal to the core of these Jupiter and planet. these are the major references. One of the things that I want to say is the major portion of my talk today is taken from this first and second reference point. Please go through these if you are interested into these kind of questions. These are very great references. Also, please refer to the Astrobytes. I mean, I found it very helpful in order to understand more and more papers about these. There were some blogs too where I have taken the information about the core excitation theories and such. And I must say I'm actually reading very. I mean, there are many papers that I'm reading about the formation theories and the core excitation as well as disk instability theories. So I guess that should be another topic and any another time if we get the time. And these are like very much resources. Also, this talk was heavily inspired by this Coursera course of solar system. This course is by Professor Mike Brown of Caltech, and he has given this excellent science of solar system course in his own website as well as the Coursera platform. And I guess it's very great. I mean, these references, the major two references that I'm telling you all, is actually I got from that course only. Yeah. So it was kind of starting point for me. And if you want to get get a basic knowledge of the planetary formation and everything, you should go and see that course. It's free on his website actually. Yeah.
And now let's take questions if someone has. Unfortunately, I can't see, but Divyanshu, you can see and answer.
Yeah. So here's a question. Why
I have
not?
a question.
Okay.
Hello. I have actually previously have knowledge of modeling neutron stars using relativity. I have read some papers and things about that equation of state. Even we have just recently some discussed in group that group as well. So I have actually joined very late in this talk. But I want to know if such relativity and these things are used in this planet formation and like that or not, and into how much extent. I mean, you have talked about models and that I have no knowledge in this field. That's why I'm asking.
Okay. The thing is, the relativity. I mean, it's kind of everywhere, right? When we are talking about huge masses. Yeah, when we are talking about huge masses, the relativity and the gravitation, actually the interference of the huge masses of Jupiter's and the solar sun should have some gravitational perturbations in the orbits of these. I mean, we have the latest example of Mercury. We understand the orbital discrepancies in the Mercury by this. So that must be the answer to your question. And second thing is, I don't know much. I haven't read enough things to tell you about exactly where we comes into the question. But I think they should when we are forming the models about the planetary disk, and when we are forming the models of the formation of starting of the solar fission and things like that. Yeah, it should definitely be there.
Okay, but I am interested in how the models you are talking about, how they actually work, and I have actually joined quite late, so I don't know whether you went through that or not.
Yeah, so just to add what Divyanshu said, can you just mute your mic? Sorry, like so that yeah. So just to what Divyanshu said, I could add something. So in the formation of these planets and then on the level of solar system, general relativity, which is formulated by Einstein, is not required to explain the planetary formation and the planetary migration and the gravitational interaction between planets. You could either use Newtonian gravity or post-Newtonian gravity, where post-Newtonian gravity is nothing but Newtonian gravity through higher orders. You consider higher order effects. And what exactly are these higher order effects and everything? We'll come to that in the future talk. So stay tuned. But to say, no, general relativity is not used in the planetary formation. And since you ask how this gravity enters into this whole picture, if you look at these basic equations that nicely put by Divyanshu, the first equation is actually telling you there is this G, right? That G if you see here, it's given by G is equal to Gm by R square is the gravity. So this formula, you got this from the Newtonian gravity. If it were some general relativity or post-Newtonian, the formula of G wouldn't have been Gm by R square. It would be something different. So if you want to consider some other strong gravity effects, then this particular equation, which is dou P by dou R is equal to minus rho times G, that G will change. So yeah,
Okay,
in this
okay.
simple model.
Okay, thank you. I got it. Thank you very much.
That's what I was saying about that. I don't know. I haven't read it about. That's why.
No, even I got to know all this just recently because I have been doing some computational astrophysics. But yeah, leave it. Any other questions for Divyanshu?
Why we not consider Pluto as in our solar system? I mean, so are you asking that why it is not called a ninth planet? So, the basic reason is that the definition given by IAU, I mean, the International Astronomical Union, is that it had it revolves around the sun. It is spherical and it goes. All thing is nice, but the major thing that it hasn't done it yet is it hasn't cleared the region around its orbit. One of the major qualities of being a planet is that it clears the region around its orbit. So actually Pluto hasn't done it yet, and that's why we don't consider it as a planet. Yeah, it is considered as a dwarf planet. Yeah. So do we have found any relationship between Goldilocks zone and giant planets? Any examples observed for the same? I'm really sorry, I don't know much about this. I mean, I know about the Goldilocks zone and the other things that we have found in the exoplanets, but I really can't connect those points. So I don't have an answer to that, but I would surely look into this if we have done it, or if anyone knows about this, they can speak.
Yeah, so one thing I could comment on this is one of the key ingredients in actually classifying a certain region around a star as Goldilocks zone is actually having some planet which can actually protect you from the asteroid's impact. Or supposing if you hadn't had Jupiter, uh, the Earth would have been bombarded with way more asteroids, and it may not have actually been in the exact orbit that Earth is now currently. Like if you remove the Jupiter suddenly out of it, then as you know, the Earth will be slowly perturbed and it will move in a different orbit. And that orbit may still or may not be inside the Goldilocks zone. And more asteroids will actually strike the Earth. So when people are trying to classify an exoplanet as an habitable planet, they not only in the Goldilocks zone, they also look at these big planets around it. So that's one small thing that I know. But yeah, Divyanshu, I mean, I think since he's into this, he can look up more and then comment more on this later on the group.
The thing that I know about giant planets is that the Jupiter actually prevented many of the collisions when the life was forming on the Earth, because the Neptune actually sends the Kuiper objects, the trans-Newtonian objects or the Kuiper belt objects inside the plane of or inside the inner regions of our solar system, and the Jupiter essentially protected our planet Earth by diverting them to outside the planet or to the asteroid belt or back to where it had come from.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation. So just to add to what I said previously, it doesn't mean that a giant planet is essential for Goldilocks zone, because it depends on the entire solar system and the structure of it, because it may happen so that there are no more asteroids in that particular solar system that we are observing. So in that case, if there is no giant planet, what I'm trying to say is that in the far future, okay, maybe I'm confusing, or is it clear?
Okay.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe we don't require a giant planet in the situation when in some solar systems when you can actually form some Earth-like planet, and it may happen that there are no stray asteroids, not a lot of them. Like there may not be some object like what Divyanju said, like Neptune, which actually sends these trans-Neptunian objects into towards inside of the solar system. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not an essential ingredient, but I think having it will actually give it more probability that the planet can be more habitable and life would have formed. But it's not compulsory. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I haven't read any recent papers regarding this, but yeah, we have found examples where we don't have any kind of giant planets, and we may think that those planets are in the Goldilocks zone around that star. What is post-Newtonian gravity? I think Surendra sir can answer that more clearly than I know.
Yeah, we'll come to post-Newtonian gravity soon. Just, I mean, you could always Google it, but I'm planning on introducing it during my talk as to what exactly post-Newtonian means. But to give you a brief idea, it's nothing but, as you see the expression here for G, G is equal to Gm by R square. So it turns out that if you want to consider, look, like if you take the Earth, right? Earth is not uniform. By uniform, I just don't mean it's oblate in shape because of the rotation, but there are some ups and downs in the field of in the Earth, right? So when you're trying to look at the gravitational field of this certain object, the first order approximation or the ground the first part of your post-Newton expansion is nothing but Gm by R square, which comes because of sourcing of gravity because of a spherical object. And as you keep adding more and more complicated structures on this simple sphere, you get more and more differences in the gravity. So to model that, you need to incorporate higher and higher orders in the gravitational field. And how exactly do we incorporate that, and what does each post-Newtonian term means, we'll come to that. But basically to say, higher orders will just capture more complicated effects compared to just your simple sphere of certain mass causing some gravitational field. That is a simple picture. But as you add rotation, as you add magnetic field, as you add another planet to this, like binary planets, or as you add more structure to the planet on top of this simple sphere, then these higher order terms actually try to capture these different complexities that you introduce into your system so that you can model your system more realistically. Yeah, more on that. We'll come to that in the future.
Oh, okay, thank you. Is Jupiter sometimes called a failed star? If yes, why so? Well, regarding that, I'm not quite sure, but I haven't actually even read a few papers on that. But I have listened that, or I've known or read from somewhere, is that if Jupiter have to have had the mass 10 times from its original mass, or 20 times, I don't exactly know the number. We can call that as few times its own mass. Then we would, the nuclear fusion would really start. We would call it a brown rock. So if anyone knows more about that, they can share their insights. But yeah, this is the reason that I understand from this question. Do similar things like plate tectonics observed predicted on other planets? Well, in order to have plate tectonics, we should have a solid surface. We are talking about the gas giants here, so we don't have any kind of solid surfaces here. By solid surfaces, I mean a kind of surface area which is on the top of the mantle. So also the plate tectonics are, on the Earth, due to the presence of water. Actually, the water cuts the areas and cuts the mantles, and these the top layers of the Earth slide around themselves, and these actually lead to the plate tectonics. We were searching for plate tectonics on Mars, but we haven't found it yet because its core has stopped. Its magnetic field has stopped. We had discovered the magnetic fields around the Mars in very small regions, around particular regions, but as a whole, Mars is not protected by the fierce radiation from the sun. and we were predicting it that the plate tectonics were present on the Mars, but we don't know yet. And obviously, it is not present here for right now.
Okay, if not, this was a really good discussion. Divyanshu, thank you for the talk. And if people have more questions, they can always talk to the speaker later.
Yeah.
And also, I think if people are interested, we could stay for 10 more minutes at max. And if people have some questions for the first talk on the stellar evolution, they can either put them in the chat or raise hand. And thank you, Divyansh. It was really good. Thank you.
Thank you all, actually.
Okay, anyone else? Anyone has questions on stellar evolution? So I think we'll have the stellar evolution questions later, but do go through the PDF. So I'll be sending a long message again later, and you can go through the message, and I'll be corresponding with Divyanshu, and he'll also put some links or any message that he wants to tell other people. So he can always do that. I think, yeah, that's all for today. And then next week, hopefully a lot of you people will go through the Bentley-Fields website and vote for a lot of papers so that we can have good discussions. See you all next week. Thank you.